I would like to welcome everyone to to the talk being given today by Charles Avila. My name is Wendy Rockwell. I am president of the International Union for Land Value Taxation and Free Trade. Um, um, I would like to um, I would like to name our sponsors that have invited their membership to participate in this activity. Um, Charles Rockenbach Foundation, Center for the Study of Economics, Council of Georgist Organizations, Public Revenue Education Council, and the Better Cities Committee, ConFed, the Lay Society, Earth Rights Institute, and the School of Cooperative Education. I would like to introduce Charles Avila. Um, he studied theology and got his master's degree in philosophy from the Divine World Seminary in Quezon City and Tagaytay City. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
He is the author of several books, including the new classic book, Ownership, Early Christian Teachings. He is a former mayor of his town of birth. He has served as consultant of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, as Secretary General of the 18 Nation Asian Culture Forum on Development, a research fellow at the Centro Intercultural de Documentación in Mexico, a staff writer of South Magazine in London, a lecturer on agrarian reform at the Land Reform Training Institute in Taiwan, a Deputy Secretary General of the Philippine Congress of Agrarian and Industrial Workers. He is the Executive Director of the Confederation of National Coconut Farmers Organization of the Philippines and Chair of the Lay Society of St. Arnold Jensen. This month, he was elected to the position of Chairman, Coconut Committee of the Philippines Government's Philippine Council of Agriculture and Fisheries. Based in Manila, he continues to be involved in the coconut levy funds case, mining issues, and the cause of the peasantry. And with that, most impressive list, I would like to introduce Charles Avila.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Dear friends, good evening, good morning, good noon, wherever you are. I am inviting you to a journey through Philippine history. I'll be using the albums of history, archaeology, economy, philology, cosmology, and theology. I have subdivided this presentation into 5. The pre-colonial archipelago, Spain grabbing it, naming it after their King Philip, America invading and leaving without leaving, the Philippines on their own with great difficulty, and China challenging America and the Philippines today. In history classes here in the Philippines, what we were by and large made most familiar with, talking about the immediate past, was that we worked and lived and moved for 400 years in the convent or under Mother Spain, 40 years in Hollywood or under the USA, 4 years in a concentration camp or under Japan, so that when we were finally born as a nation, we could not but be born free. Amnesia of identity, for imagine to be the illegitimate daughter of 3 mothers, said writer Nick Joaquin. These 40, 40, and 20 were immediately followed by a 20, 20, 30 that were no big help to our national sanity. We worked and lived and moved for 20 years, playing at democracy, while remaining essentially oligarchic, 1946 to 1966, pre-Marcos. 20 years of playing at having a strong state, 1966 to 1986, the Marcos decades, but institutionally weakened by caprice, whim, and plunder. And now 30 years plus of fumbling at avoiding the wrong path while not quite finding the right way, 1986 to the present, and prior to it all, hardly ever knowing ourselves because we were always waiting to be discovered anew by others rather than through deeper self-knowledge. All because our history classes automatically intoned that we were nothing until we were discovered by Magellan and the Europeans in 1521. Part 1. The pre-colonial archipelago. Our journey can actually start with a flashback. The Philippines arose from the bottom of the sea, and as the thin Pacific crust moved below it, continued to rise. It continues to rise today. Scientific studies done on the Earth's crust from 1964 to 1967 showed that the 35-kilometer thick crust underneath China does not reach the Philippines. Thus, contrary to earlier claims, the latter could not have been a land bridge to the Asian mainland. Evidence is that the Philippines was inhabited by anatomically modern humans as early as 22,000 years ago. A 1962 discovery proved that humans came earlier to the Philippines than to the Malay Peninsula. Therefore, the first inhabitants of the former did not come from the latter. The first stages of human civilization, according to the evidence of archaeological finds, we note that compared with the rest of the world, the stone tool technology in the Philippines dates as far back as 200,000 BC, primitive stage, and progressively evolved into a sophisticated industry by about 4000 BC, agricultural stage. Between 50,000 and 8,000 BC, they had started moving from crudely shaped stones to polished ones, cut to desired shapes, per evidence in the provinces of these are Philippine provinces, Bulacan, Batangas, Bataan, and Rizal. The pictures here are from local museums. According to archaeological finds of this early period, about 4000 BC, the people of pre-colonial Philippines had already developed both the art of making cloth and had a ceramic industry with techniques that were uniform throughout the whole archipelago. Some pots were plain while others were decorated. Burying the dead in coffins had become a custom starting that time. Around 2000 BC, our forebears had already mastered the art of mummification, a highly effective application of organic chemistry, which modern times find hard to imitate. I had a classmate who I tried hard so much to teach me how to do this. He would not do so. He died. He said that is a secret in their tribe. Between 500 to 200 BC, the people here replaced stones and shells with metal as material for technology. First with copper, followed by gold, then by bronze, and finally by iron. Um, we contrast compare our ancestors' achievements with others. Other old civilizations and monuments like the pyramids of Egypt or Mexico, the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal of India, the Angkor Wat of Cambodia, the Borobudur of Indonesia, or the Acropolis of Greece. For their part, the ancient Filipinos, let's call them that, built huge agrarian pyramids, rice terraces. These rice terraces, irrigated by a system of ditches, are stone-walled and run for thousands of feet up the mountainsides, giving from a distance the panoramic effect of a gigantic stairway to the sky. Actually, if placed end to end, the length would total an estimated 12,000 miles, or halfway around Earth. It was about 1720 BC, or 4,000 years ago, when our forebears leapt into the agricultural mode, also called in modern times in hindsight the first wave of civilization. At this stage, there was as yet no nation states anywhere. People of Earth were mostly in this Neolithic age. But the basic means of subsistence and production of wealth had now moved from mere food gathering to agriculture, with crafts and trading in significant secondary positions. Our forebears, before they were called Filipinos, were early Southeast Asians. Some 4,000 years ago, People from the southeast archipelagos all the way to the southern part of the mainland dealt a lot with each other and had many things in common, such as cognatic kinship on both mother and father side, reliance on sea for food, practice of body tattooing to show off achievements in battle, traits like slave raiding. They were river-based for water and food and transportation, highly mobile, but nonetheless isolated from one another. All around what is now the Philippine Islands were great agro-based civilizations of China, India, Siam, Khmer, Vietnam, and the Middle East. Between the 9th and 15th centuries, the people of the Philippines traded a lot with these countries and must have learned much from them. So if our forebears were truly up and about before the Spanish invasion, let us have at least some significant dates that may give us an idea of their activity. Here are some albums. 618 to 906 in the Common Era. People of this archipelago, our ancestors, are often in contact with Tang Dynasty of China. 900 CE, Mai, what is now Mindoro, a province in central Philippines, brings goods directly to Canton for the first time. 1001 CE, Buduan, that's in Mindanao, a gold mining and trading center in northeast Mindanao, sends tribute missions to Sung, China. Tributes and gifts really meant trade. 1100 in the Common Era, Malays from Borneo settle in Manila, Tondo, and intermarry with native Tagalogs. 1275, Chinese traders and Arab missionaries bring Islam to the Sulu archipelago. 1277 to 1368, Yuan dynasty trade proliferates with Visayan settlements of Buruan, Tanhay, this is in Negros, that will be the western part of the Visayan Islands, and Cebu. 1368 to 1424, Sulu sends 6 missions of tribute and trade to China during the Ming period. 1450, Sayyid Abu Bakr establishes the Sulu Sultanate that early. And in 1521, Ferdinand Magellan lands in Leyte Gulf, while 1525, Sharif Muhammad Kabungsuan arrives in southern Mindanao and converts ruling families to Islam. So we are looking at a very prosperous people in the stage of civilization identifiable at the time. So much surplus as to enable them for centuries to engage in sustained and serious trading. Let's just say 1,000 years of constant trading with neighboring peoples is no small matter. If that was the economics then what about the politics of such an economic mode? They are subject to nobody. An Augustinian friar wrote between 1565 and 67. Each one makes himself the head of his own group or herself. Thus, the majority of villages are small with only 15 or 20 or 30 houses. But actually, some have become quasi-states. Barangays, villages that had grown big with populations 2,000 Pasig to 20,000 Panay, Cebu had 3,000, Baybay in Leyte, 15,000, Kalumpit had 3,000, and Pangasinan 4,000. These are all local provinces, enough to be superior to merely kinship groups. Pigafetta, the Italian chronicler Magellan, wrote that on April 27, 1521, Lapu-Lapu mobilized hundreds of warriors overnight, pointing therefore to the existence of a chain of command. With that economy and politics, how about the cultural superstructure? The literacy rate of our forebears was very high. There is hardly a man, and much less a woman, who does not read and write, said the early Spanish historians. The ancient Filipinos used the abacada of 3 vowels and 13 consonants. However, with the imposition of the Roman alphabet by the invaders, many Filipinos became illiterate overnight, of course. The southern part of the archipelago was different. As we have seen, about 300 years before the arrival of the first Western settlers, the people of the barangays had already been exposed to the religion of Islam through the activities of Chinese, Arab, and Malay traders and missionaries. By the mid 1400s, Islam had developed the first sovereign state in the Philippines with the inauguration of the Sultanate of Hulo, and a system of madrasa, Islamic schools, was successfully introduced in the Sulu, Mindanao area. Expansion all the way to the north, Manila, by 1511 to 25. There was an increase of commerce between Brunei and Luzon. With trade came a greater propagation of the Islamic faith. Subsequently, the Islamic trade was established in Manila itself. Sulu Archipelago's location between the Asian mainland, the large islands of Mindanao, Borneo, and Celebes, with its varied and productive maritime and jungle resource base, attracted merchants from South China and from Celebes. Regional trade, regional center. Europe's trade with China made the Sulu Sultanate a very important regional redistribution center at the time, much like Hong Kong and Singapore are regarded today, no less. The annual arrival of Chinese junks and Bugis praus meant also a regular demand for local products. Thus, the Sultanate could establish itself as a powerful regional barangays at this time were Sulu, Butuan, Panay, Cebu, Leyte, Bicol, Manila Bay, Laguna Lake, and Pangasinan. Traded were agricultural and forest products, metal implements such as farm implements, kitchen utensils, weapons, marine products, jewelry out of gold, iron, semi-precious stones, woven fabrics, and ceramics. A report in 1349 by Tawi Liu of the Yuan dynasty mentioned the excellent metallurgy in the Philippines, made famous by the story of Panday Pira, and a thriving shipbuilding industry strong enough for international trade. But then, I go to part two. Suddenly, in 1521, in March 16, 1521, the Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, in search of a new trade route for Spain, stumbled upon the archipelago in its politically fragmented state. He had left Spain in 1519 to head the greatest of all epics of human discovery. Skirting unknown and uncharted lands, he sailed around the southern tip of South America, across the vast Pacific Ocean, and reached my place, Leyte Gulf, after 2 years. He moved on to Mactan, Cebu, less than a month later, and got involved in a local dispute between two chieftains who were supposed to obey him and without question, given his impressive superior firepower. These were the trade routes in the Indian Ocean around 500 to 1000 CE. It does not include the Philippines. And this is a picture of the Great Pacific. People were not sure whether and how this existed. In my province, people said that you don't go any further because you will never come back, especially when they believe that the earth was flat. You don't get off the planet. And so this is how Magellan went described earlier. And then this way. And then his party returned to Seville. This is 1519 to 1522. This is the area, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. This is Leyte Gulf we're talking here. This is Leyte. I come from. So, but unfortunately for Magellan, the chieftain of Mactan Island, Lapu-Lapu by name, was not a very impressionable man. Magellan was killed in battle, and the rest of the crew had to get out fast, arriving back in Seville in 1522. Nonetheless, the Spaniards managed to come back, and Spanish rule took a firm foothold in the islands. The people of the Philippines, excluding the strongly Islamized zones of the south, will now be subjected not only to a continuous process of colonization, subjugation, and exploitation, but also to the overwhelming impact of Western religion, literature, law, and customs. The result, previously Islamized, now Hispanized, the Filipino developed into an Asian in Western garb, or more significantly, a Hispanized Asian, unique and distinct from all the other nations around her. The forcible invasion led to a colonial economy, which engendered a colonial politics and put on a colonial mentality and culture, making the Filipino at one time clear-headed and brave, at other times plain confused and amnesiac. Loose decentralized structures made domination by foreign power great probability. Had the Spaniards arrived 50 years later, the story may have been quite different. But they did come at the time they did. The 1560s, some 40 years after the unsuccessful Magellanic invasion, the Spanish returned to the Visayas and heard Manila was a more strategic trading area. So, Legazpi, he headed the Spanish team, conquers Manila, and sure enough, a year later, the galleon trade begins. Not Manila, Acapulco so much as trade between America and Asia, with Manila as transshipment point. This was the Great Trans-Pacific Transatlantic Trade, 1565 to 1815, before there was a Suez or a Panama Canal. Through the Manila galleons, the American worlds were linked by untold luxuries and wealth. And sure enough, too, before the century ended, from the south, Maguindanao Datus, in 1599, with 50 vessels and 3,000 warriors, attacked central Philippines and returned to southern Mindanao with 800 captives. Then a year later, 1600, the Spanish battled the Dutch over Manila, beating the Dutch but not before losing a flagship and 300 men. 1603, a mass uprising by the Chinese, resulting in 20,000 of them massacred by the Spanish. 1609, labor conscripting becomes formal. We call this the polos y servicios. 1611 to 71, 60 years. And man named Sultan Kudarat ruled Maguindanao. 1637 to 39, the Spanish defeat Maguindanaos and expeditions are launched into the Lanao region, Sulu Archipelago, and Brunei. 1639, Chinese again revolt, rocks Manila. And 1642, the same Kudarat defeats the Spanish and captures Delhi leader. In 1645, a peace treaty. And 1656 to 58, Kudarat wars on the Spanish again. I'm looking at this 1 century. It is like talking about the present time. War, peace treaty, war and more peace treaties. Okay. Elsewhere in the world, a new mode of production came up that could produce so much more wealth had been discovered, invented, and installed. The industrial mode of producing wealth. This is the stage where people discovered or invented machines to produce goods, including machines no more than 300 years old, characterized by the ability to mass produce, to unlock the secrets of the material world, that even alter the face of the earth for better or for worse. We know this, the so-called second wave of civilization. But in this colonial economy, Spanish, actually European colonization, essentially froze Philippine economic development at the agricultural stage to forcibly serve the rising industrialization of the colonizing countries. So the once proud peoples of these hundreds of islands who for centuries flourished and produced and traded and moved about in freedom were now captive in reservation towns, resettlements, or reducciones, and got caught in the crossfire between the followers of Islam who had earlier fought back the Spanish invader, and they conquered, they were called Indios, so that two nations who were really one people were made to fight each other, the Moro and the Indio. So in the 1700s, we see this happening. Sulu Maguindanao, Sultanates fighting for control, the friars getting stronger, they even executed a reformist governor in the person of General Fernando Bustamante, another peace treaty between Spain and Sulu. Then Manila, Northern Luzon road system opens. Now we are modernizing. And then in central Philippines, in the province of Bohol, Juan Daguhoy, after Jesuit refused to give his brother Christian burial, revolted. Look at how long his revolt lasted, 1744 to 1829. The revolts in Cavite and Batangas over access to and control of haciendas. The British invade again Manila, sparkling revolts in Pampanga, Pangasinan, Ilocos Sur. This is a century of revolts. At one time, I tried to check and do a matrix on how many revolts. More than 300 revolts. Almost every other year, there was a revolt in this country. Meantime, consistent with agricultural development, a wrenching cultural revolution exploded, so powerful that it created the most stubborn characteristic of Philippine society to this very day, namely, the rule of the few, by the few, and for a few, while at the same time bringing about the beginnings of national consciousness, the heightened awareness that the people born here were not the same as the people invading us from elsewhere. Sun is out. This rule of the few, by the few and for a few, was in contrast to the very early idea during the protracted Neolithic age of a communal way of producing the life necessities. The basic unit of production was the barangay, village, with leadership dictated by kinship ties. Thus, no one ever thought or said of land, their basic needs of subsistence, this is mine. Rather, everyone understood that the land was ours for everyone to use. With foreign occupation, however, a weird notion of legal title to the land appeared and even encouraged competition and fights to individually own hitherto communal lands, to appropriate for themselves as their exclusive property lands that in their mind and in actual practice had truly belonged to all. In this privatization struggle, the big winners were the friars of the Catholic Church, cornering 48% of total arable lands. How a group that had a vow of poverty could do that is a big miracle. This process of individual titling accelerated throughout the 17th century and produced a society of a few non-producing owners, a broad majority of non-owning producers, and a little slice of halves a little. The making of the Ilustrado. During the 18th century and on to the 19th, the impact of the commercial revolution based on the foreign demand for such crops as sugar, tobacco, and indigo was felt up and down this new oligarchic system. Chinese mestizos, half-breeds, offspring of Chinese and Filipino intermarriage, also began the rise to economic power. The consumption needs of Manila were supporting a very lucrative internal trade. Chinese mestizos who were naturals at business gained control of the trade routes that linked Manila with the central plain of Luzon. A developing cash economy encouraged the religious orders, the biggest owners of land then, despite their vow poverty, to lease to civil lessees the lands they could not till themselves. The Chinese mestizo class dominated the leasing of these lands and arranged for native peasants to sharecrop the land. Appropriate war of the commons branched out to money lending operations. The peasants mortgaged their land by the Spanish contract known as Pacto de Retroventa, known in Filipino as Sanglang Bili, which was in English a sale option to repurchase. Unable to pay the option to repurchase lapsed. The mestizo money lender acquired full ownership of the land. This way, the land was further concentrated in the new landlord class, while the majority of tillers ended up with no lands they could call their own, being and having. Now, they had close to nothing. Hacienda system. As early as 1570, Spain had already established the encomienda, which became a tool of exploitation. People were dispossessed of the land upon which they staked their very lives. They were reduced to absolute penury and degradation. By the 19th century, through the hacienda system, vast tracts of land were appropriated mostly by Spanish mestizos and Spaniards who came directly from Spain. For the native populations, original owners of these islands, the question of being and having had become most problematic now, for the foreigner and a few of his favored ones had come to own the lands and the workers on that land. Spirit versus letter of the law. So after hundreds of revolts, in the latter part of the 19th century, Spanish government desired to facilitate the obtaining of titles, all without cost, a policy allegedly intended to rectify the sad plight of the peasantry. To the latter, the customary division of the crops was mitad, or 50-50. But the peasants furnished the tools and work animals. In addition, they were compelled to borrow money from the landlord at exorbitant interest rates. So in fact, they worked for the landlord without pay. But unfortunately, the land reform laws mentioned above, then as now, had the opposite effect. The Principalia, land grabbers turned honorable landlords, used the opportunity to register their lands and to claim extensive areas occupied by their smallholder neighbors. Illiterate and ignorant of the processes of foreign law, the peasants were helpless and were unable to protect themselves. So one foundational idea, this twisted notion of having, could, and did truly wreak havoc on the whole people's social being. Where once there was a well-nigh egalitarian society, now rose on account of that unjust concept, a monster of an oligarchy that would prove so very difficult to slay. Ironically, however, it was the emergence of this propertied class that gave birth to a new nation, which sought at first reforms and, failing which, radicalized into seeking separation and independence. And this was the story of the 1800s. Quickly, the colonists were granted the right of representation in the Cortes. Cortes is the legislature in Spain. Liberal governments were coming up there. In fact, there was a newspaper now in the Philippines, government-owned. The Cadiz Constitution, as it was called, gave Manila a taste of individual liberties. And the galleon trade ended in 1815. That was bad news for the Spaniards. The Spanish free captives in Sulu. Separation of executive and judicial functions is mandated. The alcalde mayor and governor general levels. And I mention here because it's very special. Rizal is born June 19, 1861. 1863, a public school system is mandated by law. 1864, a Filipino priest, Jose Burgos, issues manifesto against Spanish discrimination. 1868, the Guardia Civil mandated to suppress crimes and insurrections. And Father Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, we call them Gombursa, they were executed. So a new nation was, a new sense of nationalism was threatening Spain, and they were getting more scared and fascistic. 1873, more Philippine ports opened to world trade. 1887 to 91, Rizal's novels were published. 1892, the Manila Pangasinan Railroad. Pangasinan is north of Manila. 1895, the revolutionary organization, secret organization called the Katipunan. 1896, execution of Rizal. He was only 35 years old. Philippine Revolution ensues. And he succeeded. Philippine independence from Spain, 1898. Philippine government was inaugurated. Philippine Constitution, a full-fledged Philippine parliament. But then, few minutes later, the U.S. declares war on Spain and comes about the Philippine-American War, 1899. So part 3, the Philippines gives America year 1 of empire. No sooner had the Ilustrado-led nationalists put an end to Spanish colonialism than they found themselves fighting another enemy, the American empire. Why would a democratic republic like America now turn imperialist? U.S. Senator Beveridge explained, "We are a conquering race. We must obey our blood and occupy new markets, and if necessary, new lands. American factories are making more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours." The senator was quite perceptive. He found in the essence of American capitalist economy the persistent urge to expand, to dominate, and of course, to defend the political order that its expanding economy created. Yes, this was all about ownership on another level. The American capitalists knew that their capital must go where it makes the largest profits. It must expand or go under. But how would one or could one morally justify the country grab? Only with the help of religio-cultural gobbledygook. The moment of truth came to the chief executive of the White House. In his own words later, President William McKinley described that moment to a delegation of Methodist dignitaries. "I thought first that we would take only Manila," he said, "then Luzon, then other islands perhaps also. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. One night late, it came to me this way. I don't know how, but it came. That there was nothing left for us to do but to take the ball and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. And by God's grace, do the very best we could for them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died." And then I went to bed. I went to sleep. I slept soundly. And the next morning, I sent for the chief engineer of the War Department, our map maker, and told him to put the Philippines on the map of the United States. And there they are, pointing at the map. And there they will stay while I am president. This became common sight. this weird process of Christianizing a predominantly Catholic country and educating a nation whose universities were older than Harvard resulted in a Holocaust. Said one congressman in 1902, quite proudly after a visit to the Philippines, our soldiers took no prisoners. They kept no records. They simply swept the country, and whenever and wherever they could get hold of a Filipino, they killed him. Ownership was basically about this: to have and to hold. Once you got it, you better defend it or you will surely lose it. This whole business had to turn quite violent, and indeed it did. Those more skilled in body count, the art of body counting, said that the US sent 126,468 soldiers to fight the nationalist Filipinos in 2,811 battles, spent $500 million to kill roughly 600,000 Filipinos, 1/6 the total population of Luzon at the time, and put themselves in a better position to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipino Catholics. By 1913, with the Philippines once again a conquered land, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act established free trade and product specialization between the U.S. and its new colony, effectively making of the Philippines a source of raw materials at cheap prices and a dumping ground for finished products at higher prices. Updating the colonial economy, the U.S. version. To reinforce this colonial economic policy, a colonial education was also established. The basic objective of the system was to persuade the Filipinos that good things are American things, good literature is American English literature, good music is American music, good custom is American custom, etc. Thus, in Philippines, A was for apples, although apples do not grow in the Philippines. C was neither for coconut nor even for the native root crop camote, but for the imported cherry. If the pupils, however, flunked in class, the American teacher would say, better go home and plant camote. Filipinos were taught to dream of a white Christmas, and all the Christmases they had known were brown. They were taught to brush their teeth, yes, but curiously enough, not to make toothbrush. In short, they were taught to despise themselves as they were, and the things they would always have, like coconuts, and long for things they would never have. In short, they had to try to become what they were not, brown Americanitos. The successful suppression of the Filipino armed struggle to recover their independence and freedom did not drive all militants underground. The pragmatists bowed to American victory after the genocide of almost 1 million Filipinos, but continued the struggle in non-violent ways, meaning in the compromise of the parliamentary struggle and not without success, howsoever limited and deceitful. The American policy of benevolent assimilation did the trick. More colonial dependence under an independence must. At the end of this half a century of parliamentary struggle came the Tidings McDuffie Act to keep the Philippines economically while letting them govern themselves politically. That's in the prefatory note of that bill. For starters, they levied an excise tax on Philippine coconut oil, the Philippines' most important export then as now. The amount of the tax was equal to 3 cents per pound of the oil extracted either in the Philippines or in the U.S. of copra of Philippine origin. Also, land reform laws were enacted, but principally to function as anti-insurgency measures because the revolts would not stop. So in the 1900s, this is what we saw. What a difference a few decades can make. Philippine-American War continues. Aguinaldo, the president of the Philippines, his government unravels. The Ilustrados get tired of fighting. They organize the Federal Party. Aguinaldo is captured. U.S. civil government is established. and elections for the first Philippine Assembly, President Quezon, Vice President Osmeña era. Free trade, as said before, the Jones Law promised Philippine independence. Stop revolting, stop fighting. We will give you independence as soon as a stable government is established. 1924, the rebellions continued. They were called the colorums. They attacked constabulary units. The land rebel Sakdal movement accused Filipino politicians of misgovernance and their demand for independence hypocritical. The PKP, Communist Party, was established. Tan Malaka, it's an Indonesian, and Crisanto Evangelista were the founders. Tan Malaka is a very colorful guy. From Indonesia, he went to Holland, ran for parliament and won Holland, and was captured and then escaped back to the Philippines and was able to style himself as a Filipino when he was in Manila. 34, the tidings of Avila. We were allowed to have our own constitution, but it had to be approved by President Roosevelt in 1935. But earlier than the US, women's suffrage wins in the plebiscite in the Philippines in 37. And in 39, Japan expansionism was noted, so the Department of National Defense was created. But for this past, Japan invades in 1941 after Pearl Harbor. Puppet Philippine Republic was established under President Laurel. MacArthur comes back in 44, so President Osmeña takes over. Independence was given in 1946, July 4th. First president dies in office. Quirino succeeds him. The Hukbalhap, however, land-based, land strugglers, but now this time led by a united front of communists and socialists, mounted an offensive. They almost won until Magsaysay got into power and crushed them. At this time, too, the Federation of Free Farmers was organized. I belong to that group on the tail end of the Hope movement. The new president, Garcia, who was more nationalist, established the Filipino First policy, import substitution industrialization. Macapagal in 61, he authored with Mr. Manglapus the Land Reform Code of 1963, famously known as the Republic Act 3844. Okay. Old-style imperialism and neocolonialism are one. The development of underdevelopment. In the Philippines, the word underdeveloped is not a mere adjective because it is, more accurately, the past tense of an active verb. The massive poverty keenly felt by the majority population is essentially traceable to the arrested development, or to use another phrase, the underdevelopment of the Philippine economy. That is, its dependence on the backward kind of agricultural mode that fails to provide a strong basis for genuine industrial development. Third wave of civilization, the post-industrial information-based mode. The first wave was characterized by the plow or the hoe, the second by the assembly line, and now the third is characterized by the computer or the cell phone. The homogeneity of second wave society may now be replaced by the heterogeneity of third wave civilization. Applied to the Philippines, the first, second, and third waves would look like this. The first wave, agriculture. We are not doing well because we have not linked it to the second wave, industrial, processing, infrastructure of farm to market linkages, of irrigation, warehouses, etc. Nor have we let it be serve the third wave, information. For example, the farmer should know what to plant, how much to plant, when to plant, what prices to expect, where to bring his produce, and avoid the perennial wastage of overproduction that inevitably leads to underproduction, needless importations, and endless frustrations for all producers and consumers alike. We need to harmonize the uneven stages of development, which, because of the peculiar history we have been through, we find ourselves in now. More albums of history. You're familiar with this now. Marcos comes into power 66. ASEAN was organized 67. Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army, started in 1968. This is a new version of what I mentioned earlier as the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, which was Russia-oriented. This one now was China-oriented. At the same time, the Christian social movement was busy organizing the free workers and the free farmers. They were called the Moderatos. They started rising to prominence in 69. But in 70, the students went on the first quarter storm and big troubles in what we here call Plaza Miranda in 71, which led to the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. And in 72, following the Nixon doctrine, Mr. Marcos declared a martial law regime, shortly after which, the More National Liberation Front inaugurated its existence and resisted the Marcos martial law regime. Okay. Neo-colonial, center periphery, weak and unstable, foreign control and dependent. Down the decades, Philippine economy stayed weak and unstable. It was merely a part of an ensemble whose center was located abroad, specifically in the countries of the old colonizers. In this transnational arrangement, the former colonizers had become the center economies, and former colonies like the Philippines were absorbed as periphery economies of the world economy, the classic neo-colonial malaise. The shift to industrialization in the Philippines was merely a consequence of the shift in the center countries towards production of machines, vehicles, and equipment goods whose increasing surplus created a need to dump these elements of constant capital somewhere. Thus was made possible the import substitution type of industries which characterized periphery economies like the Philippines for many years. The economic development in process for neo-colonies absorbed into a globalized world had become one of unequal dependent development. So in the late 70s, more unrest comes about. This was now martial law. And Juan Ninoy Aquino, a traditional politician, remained in jail and was fast becoming a hero, a national hero. And in fact, he ended up a national martyr in 1983. He was shot dead at the airport when he was coming back to the United States. It led to the biggest funeral ever recorded in human history, the funeral of Ninoy Aquino. New stage of capitalism, underdeveloped and dependent. The global economy had now become the playing field of global corporations. The idea was the same, to deny sovereignty to the national economies. The Philippines, by the march of history, wittingly or unwittingly, left behind the feudal order and entered the new stage of capitalism. But it is both an underdeveloped and a dependent type of capitalism in which it finds itself now not necessarily producing prosperity for us. And this new capitalism is a globalized phenomenon. Thus, the workers or capitalism spawns are not necessarily for the enterprises within our territorial limits. Our workers, our people are there for the global economy. We have seen this new diaspora of Filipinos just about everywhere, anywhere in the world. Any old day, there are at least some 10 million Filipinos working abroad and in all the seven seas. But it remains a rather rich place on the planet, arguably enough to make a prosperous nation. 30 million hectares of land, 220 million hectares of water, 12 million hectares of arable land, 20,000 kilometers of coastline, a biodiversity of plant and animal species unequaled anywhere on Earth, mineral prospectivity fifth only in the planet, marine fish world in the top 20 world, and in the top 20 worldwide, above all, 110 million people, literate, resilient, and a big percentage well traveled. But careful, the forests are dwindling. When the US started in the early 1900s, it occupied 70% of our country's land area. In 1913, by one little act, redefining forest products as agricultural export crops. Between then and 1946, when the Americans left, they supposedly left, we had cut down forests to from 70% to 30%, and we're still very much at it. So, we suggested back to basics, restructuring our political economy. First, our agriculture must be made more productive and more just in benefits distribution. Second, since our agriculture is the mother of industry, our industrialization program must and may not be centered abroad, but rather based on the surpluses of the highly productive agriculture at home. Third, a complete engine of growth must be found in some area of our economy that will enable our country to achieve some self-reliance and self-sufficiency, not vulnerable to the buffetings by various world conditions. If at all possible, and it is, we must find in our own country the material for sustainable growth and at the same time develop an effective market, first of all, within our territorial limits, at the same time that we regard the regional and international market. Fifth, the type of industrialization the Philippines must pursue has to be, in net terms, favorable to agriculture and related economic sectors. It is not quite useful to have a factory that employs 300 people at the cost of displacing from agricultural work some 3,000 others in a given locality. And sixth, the Philippines must pursue careful industrialization. It is not worth it to enter the industrial mode only to perish in our own pollution. With the proper leadership and political will, we should be able to avoid the more negative aspects of entering the industrial mode of production and maybe be one of the first in the world to go straight through careful industrialization to a more convivial post-industrial mode. There would be a new this would bring about a new social foundation where justice, peace, and prosperity can truly become the order of the day. Seventh, people's ownership of government is crucial. Their freedom and prosperity to their freedom and prosperity. Government, however, is not only national. It is first of all local. It is at this level then that people must realize that they can be self-reliant, and the means to this end of self-reliance among local governments, I am beginning to learn and to study, is land value taxation. Part 5 in China Duterte dictatorship. More than 30 years after people power toppled down a US-backed dictatorship, a new authoritarianism with all its consequences looms in the horizon, this time not US-backed. A dictatorship in progress. It is the CDD or China Duterte dictatorship. All the signs of preparation for an autogolpe and a revolutionary government are now in place. Mr. Marcos started off with closing down media, incarcerating people, announcing the latter activity in slow motion for effect, and dramatizing the public execution of a convicted drug lord. He then proceeded to rule by decree and always denied before international audiences any responsibility for the systematic violation of human rights, the arbitrary detentions, the tortures, and the salvagings or extrajudicial killings. His dictatorship was made possible by American backing, so he had to design and follow an ostensibly democratic script with the trappings of mock elections and rubber stamp legislatures, even to the point, years later, of lifting martial law, quote unquote, lest a liberal American media swamp the conservative rulers with pressures to abandon him as they earlier did with the South Vietnamese government. Mr. Duterte's style was a bit different. He did not publicly execute a convicted drug lord, since Philippine statutes do not allow the death penalty anymore. Rather, he declared a so-called war on drugs and publicly assured the police he would back them up for killings they committed in their line of duty. Killings he publicly encouraged them to do, resulting to date, according to most estimates, in more than 30,000 deaths and an atmosphere of fear beyond the war zones. Also against this calculation. This is only the second time in the past 50 years that China has had a chance to establish a veritable province in Southeast Asia and a chance at last to control the South China Sea with its incredible wealth and strategic character the sea lies of communicate. The US is in possession, that is true, with Philippine-US treaty warranties, but China just about owns the Philippine president. And if they could only make him a dictator, problem solved, as in North Korea. Last time China tried this tack was long ago in Sukarno's Indonesia. There, China terribly miscalculated at the cost of almost a million Indonesian lives. I think I'll rest here for now and be open for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic, Charles.
Thank you,
Absolutely
David.
fantastic. Thank you very, very, very much indeed. What an extraordinary story. One certainly I was never aware of, but certainly wish to know a very great deal more. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it makes such sense alongside what you've written before on ownership, on the whole question of ownership. An extraordinary story, wonderful story, tragic story. Thank you so much. But what
And
next?
a continuing story, David. Continuing.
A continuing story, yes.
Yes.
So whence all this, Charles? I wonder if you can tell us just a little. I mean, has this come straight from your history, or have you had to do a lot of research for this particular presentation? It certainly comes across as though this is deeply embedded in what you've known for a long time.
Yes.
Can you tell us?
Actually, not from our history books, because for the most part, um, they were written to make us we always conscious that Magellan discovered us.
Yeah.
But since the mid 1960s, when I got involved with peasant organizing, I just took it upon myself to, with other people, to do a lot of research on our own. And we were not without friends in academia. It was difficult, and we continue with our research. So uh, to us, history is a story. It's our story. Huh?
Mm.
It is something we can relate to in a continuing flow of events, personalities, and sometimes we talk about all these dead people as if they're just in the other room. Because so many of them also in the past, let us say, 5, 6 decades of my activism, were people we had known personally, and it is not easy to think of them as already dead. They are around, they are there, And we're hoping that we will get more of the new generations to help us along as
One thing that came across to me particularly, Charles, was in a sense the corruption of the religions and of the religious.
yes,
And knowing your background and your training and your own faith,
yes.
that
It's
must be,
very
yes, please say something along about that,
it's
as it were,
very
the starting
interesting
and the
because yeah, as you know, the Catholic faith was used a lot by both Spain and Portugal. So not just in the Philippines, but all over South America as a tool of legitimizing what they were doing. And at the same time, uh, you always had good and bad with them. You know, Bartolome de las Casas, famous guy in South America, went back to Spain, and it's one of those who really wrote and fought very hard against slavery. No, he was an archbishop. He was also a monk at one time. Now, in the Philippines, I think they were more clever because although the Spanish imperial rule was to impose the Spanish language on all their colonies, the friar here said that would be tragic if we followed that. So they wanted to make sure that the natives, let's call them that, they call them the Indios, would not learn Spanish. They rather learn the languages themselves. And then they destroyed the native religions. Now, but then uh, here's something sometimes very hard to explain in that but the superstructural religion or superstructural church existed, reflecting the economics and the politics of a colonial dispensation, there was always the infrastructural religion. Huh? In the sense that people were naturally religious. They were taught the Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. They believe that God is their father, our father. And therefore all goods must be family goods. And they have to fight for the land that belongs to all. You see, that was a very strong, call it ideology, but actually it was a faith that they have. The same words that was used by the friars in prayer, while the friars did a good job of grabbing the lands and promoting even more superstition and more superstition, um, the peasants, uh, would you say they had their own innate wisdom, their own innate wisdom. They knew what was right and wrong, and they knew what because the proof of that was they kept on rebelling. The hundreds of revolts were there. You could not explain it without their faith in God.
I think in a sense, what I think I've picked up there, Charles, and sorry, I must stop after this one, is that there's a grain of truth in what the friars and an essence of truth in what they brought, but it was wrapped, or rather it was permeated by an untruth as well. And so there's the two elements. And if I've understood what you've just said, is that the essential truth was recognized by the indigenous population because it was not contradictory to their existing wisdom or faith.
Yes,
But
yes.
with it, so that made it, as it were, the invaders acceptable in a measure.
Yes.
And that then is the pollution or the corruption creeps in such a way.
Yes.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah. I've seen Ed Dodson's hand up for quite a while, and
Are you want me to talk, Alana?
and so Ed, might you go ahead?
Okay. My
Yes.
question, Charles,
Yes, you had your hand up.
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
My question really, after this
Can we stop sharing?
long story of tragedy, is the current environment, the population. You're in a part of the world that's really in harm's way with climate change as well as the pandemic.
Yes.
Are the Filipino people at all confident that your government can deal with these extreme challenges?
Right now, the people are cooperating. The lockdowns were fine, but now I think a point has been reached in which sometimes they are questioning whether what kind of problem do we have? Do we have a security problem or a health problem? That's the question of the people. Huh? Because if it were a health problem, we should be seeing more doctors and more medical personnel, not more soldiers and not more guns, and not more authoritarianism. So that is not that they do not think that the pandemic is not real, because they have seen people die. Huh? But no, it's not that. It's just that whether or not it can be used by some political beings to take advantage, um, to set up a more authoritarian dispensation. But bottom line, I think that they still have faith in their government. They criticize it a lot. They criticize the Secretary of Health so much. Huh? They criticize even the president for not immediately acting, because when this news came out first, he still encouraged the Chinese to come back, to come to the Philippines, come and visit, come and stay. And I think he found out that the people might not forgive him, so he changed course. He changed course.
A follow-up question, if I might. Is there an out-migration of the people who are educated or who could be most useful in changing the system? Are a lot of people leaving the Philippines because of the political situation?
There was a lot. Of course, these COVID times have slowed everything down, but the overseas Filipino worker is not just the crewing of the ships of the world, but that includes doctors and engineers and professionals, and they call it here the brain drain. No, they train so many of these teachers and these nurses, and they end up in Alabama or in some other states. Also, doctors. Yes, the answer to the question is yes, because to many of them, staying in the Philippines merely to produce more poverty doesn't make sense. No? When the farmers try their very best, but there's no food security system as a system. When they succeed, they fail, in the sense that when they succeed, then prices will go down. So they stop planting the next round. And their children, the younger guys, who should be inheriting their father's or their mother's lands and become better, even better farmers, don't do that anymore. They would rather go abroad, work abroad, send money. And that's what I mentioned earlier. Any old day, there are 10 million of them around the world.
Hmm.
That's a lot of people.
Could we stop sharing screen, Alana?
Yeah, let's get this out. How do I do this?
Oh, stop the,
This
okay,
title.
now who else has a question?
Because we can't see each
Comment.
other.
Who will, while we do that, who's the next person who wants to ask a comment, ask a question, or make a comment to Charles? Is that you, James?
Well, yes, it doesn't seem to me that the climate change and the pandemic have much to do with the problems and circumstances which the country finds itself in. Charles has just referred to the diaspora of the Philippines, scattered all over the world, and the poor system of trade and agriculture. And I suppose the China is a threat, is it not, to the governance of the country? These are the real areas of concern, are they not? I mean, I'm taking a stab at it. I don't know.
Yeah,
but,
yes. Yes, that's correct. But in addition, there's even what we are calling here the big U-turn, meaning many of the Filipino workers, say in the Middle East, are coming back. They're coming back. In short, the pandemic has this kind of effect also on our workers abroad, that it is not easy for them to find work even where they are now. And so they are in a sense forced to come back home.
so
And
that could be positive, couldn't it? But if they can be found employment, which I suppose is questionable, because they went abroad to get employment, didn't they?
yes. Now, I have been part of a small group that have been trying to dialogue with them, because another group friend of mine was busy organizing them abroad. So that, because when many of them, when they come back, they are no longer welcome in their homes. They say, well, what happened? You're coming back to bring us the virus. Actually, this group that has tied up with one university here, the Ateneo de Manila University, we're trying to see how we can encourage them to go into a linkage directly with organized groups here to go back this time more seriously into the kind of agricultural development that people did not go into earlier. So a lot of webinars going on in that direction. In fact, I would say the past month I was involved in 8 or 10 of these webinars for the leaders of the overseas Filipino workers. Yes.
In what way does the Chinese challenge to America impact on the Philippines?
Yeah. Come again.
In which way does the Chinese challenge to the Americans in the Pacific impact on
the impact of the Chinese challenge is gross, in the sense that the president of this country goes out of his way to kowtow to the Chinese. Even with the West Philippine Sea, and we had one cases in the ICC, the International Court. It is the president of this country that favors China, not the Philippines. He has allowed legally more than 3 million new entrants from China into the country also. Now, I am worried about that because I am worried about that might lead to some kind of immoral racism on the part of the locals. Huh? Remember, in the history I gave you earlier, there were a few times when the Chinese were massacred by the thousands at a time when the population was not that big. They, because of course at the time the Chinese came here because of the poverty in South China. You know, until Mao Zedong, China just the history of floods and drought and famine, and they their salvation for the most part, those from the south, was to go to the archipelagos. So the nearest archipelagic country then was the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia. And so, but in the Philippines, they intermarried well, and they're part of us. And now these Chinese who are part of us, I always say part of us, our national hero is Chinese. Jose Rizal has Chinese blood. A very popular president, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, has Chinese blood. So uh, many times it is the local Filipino Chinese that are a little scared about the president's policy of favoring the mainland Chinese coming in, because they're afraid that the other sectors of the Philippine society uh, may come back with a vengeance, and you never know what happens. There might be a repeat of historical irrationality and riots.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm seeing if there's any other comments and questions while I keep seeing. I have one, Charles.
Yes,
And
please.
this is Alana. You made one bold statement that you saw that land value taxation could be very important for strengthening, as I understood, strengthening your cities, your local economies. Could you
Yes.
say a little more how you envision what the benefits and impact of a land value tax system could be on the Philippines?
Yeah, well, what I say, Alana, is very tentative because I'm still a student, still
Uh-huh.
studying. But in general, the situation of finance in the Philippines has been too centralized in the national government, and has made many of the local governments very dependent on the generosity of the national, despite the local government code, despite so many programs that should, in theory, core or help the local government units. So I say that if the local government units will begin to understand that they can raise funds themselves locally, huh?
Yeah.
As I have seen in your area in Harrisburg, in Pennsylvania, as I have seen in many of the case studies that I was reading when uh, we had so many discussions at table with the different friends in the CGO, the Congress of Georgia's organizations. I think that we might be able to organize a good group of mayors and provincial governors, and I mean, I'm hoping, I'm hoping to be able to do this at some time and really review the tax habits, the tax structure, the tax laws, and if it can be done, one incentive would be, I think, for the local government to see that they could indeed become more and more self-reliant and self-sufficient. Um,
You know, I very much see this huge problem same way in the United States. I mean, we started with these 13 Eastern colonies and we have
yes,
Washington, D.C., but now it's a whole transcontinental country. And the federal government in Washington has become so corrupted, and our two-party system so corrupted by the big money, the big corporations, and so on, that I see a very strong value in a land value tax, just as you're seeing it, for localizing the economy and for getting out of the control of the centralized government. That's one. Two is your mention of organizing mayors. The United Nations Center for Human Settlements, often called the UN Habitat Agency, which our International Union for Land Value Taxation has been very involved in for quite a while now, is the agency that works most closely with mayors. And every 2 years, they have an international conference for largely mayors. So the mayors who are already involved in that in the Philippines, you might want to for sure connect with, because UN Habitat has a strong platform that includes land value based taxes and our land value capture, no might by different names, but it would be very a good step, I think, to be able to show that that mayor's organization through UN Habitat is already very interested in the land value tax policy. Yeah,
That's great.
way
That's great.
forward for you there. Who else would like to? Michael Leroy.
Thank you very much for your talk. I found it inspirational and very, very thought-provoking. A couple of phrases I picked up. Can you say a bit more about these, perhaps? You mentioned the rule of the few, by the few, for the few, and a possible way of get out of this. It's a more communal way of living. I found that quite something to reflect upon. And the other thing was, you mentioned that globalization denies sovereignty, and you mentioned an illustration about the forest, how that's, and that was revelatory as well, because they give a different view. Globalization denies sovereignty of a country. It takes away its freedom to work. And the other thing was the materials for our own sustainable growth. All these things, they're all a bit vague, but they all rang a bell with me, all these phrases, but which were new to me. And so any more, and I'll have to study your talk, perhaps in transcript form, because there's so much there. Thank you very, very much.
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Who else now? Please unmute yourself, or if you raise your hand, I'll unmute you and join in your thoughts and comments on this wonderful, powerful presentation Charles has given us.
Well, just a follow-up, really, only a matter of administration, I guess. But Michael's asked there for a transcript. What would actually be particularly useful would be, and I know the whole thing will come as a video on YouTube, which is very, very useful, but it would be very nice to have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation itself, if that's possible. Charles, if you're able to distribute that, that would be a particularly valuable thing, because in fact the transcript is essentially you read, but you read with such feeling that it was made all the more valuable because it was read, but the words themselves were all there in your slides. So if it were possible to have a copy, that would be particularly appreciated.
Yes. No problem. I have given the copy to Alana, so you're free to share it.
Okay, anybody who, let's see, how should we do this? Anybody who wants a copy, you see my name on the screen, alanahartsock@gmail.com. My name at gmail.com. Just email me and I'll send it to Charles. I'll send Charles to you, the PowerPoint to you. At the same time, at some point, we will post it on the iu.org website, if with Charles' permission. We'll have it on the website. But if you'd like it directly, he's now given me permission to give it to you. Just ask me.
Yes, please go ahead and share.
What is that email again?
Well, do you see my name on the screen?
Yeah.
Alana Hartzog at gmail.com.
I wonder, Charles, if you could say a little more, because you put it in inverted commas, and you're aware that as far as the IU is concerned, we're championing land value taxation and free trade. But the free trade that you indicated within inverted commas was clearly not free trade.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of nonsense that's going on at the moment in relation to the UK's Brexit thing, as we're negotiating supposedly free trade, as though you needed a deal to trade freely. I wonder if you'd like to say anything about that within the Filipino context, as I say, you put free trade in inverted commas.
Yes, because clearly during the colonial era, it had to be in inverted commas. There was no free trade.
No.
None. But the point I also made was the older, if you might call it, the old style of colonialism gave way to a new style, the neo-colonial setup.
Yeah.
And so we describe it as the center periphery phenomenon. You know, to industrialize in the Philippines for a long time meant some funny activities like we import all kinds of chemicals, put them into small bottles, shake them in the Philippines. We call them industrialization. We import flat iron sheets, corrugate them in the Philippines, call it industrialization. We get some parts of a jeep and parts of another, put them together somewhere in the Philippines in a free trade zone, and we call it industrialization. In the meantime, you had materials for self-sustaining, careful industrial mode. Let us. I don't want to start talking about it because I will not stop talking if I do. And it's about my good example is the coconut with 1,000 uses. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
And can just imagine what possibilities there are there for the right kind of industrialization.
Yeah.
No, in who is not for free trade in theory? If we want free trade, we want freedom of trading, freedom of movement, freedom of everything.
Yeah.
But you know, if the word is used to deceive, then we have to put it in inverted commas.
Well, in that context, one's impressed by the
Charles,
art,
do you? Yeah,
the
go
art,
ahead.
sorry, the artisanship that you illustrated in the traditional Filipino way that didn't require machines. It was just artistry in this context. And one could see the self-sufficiency, if there was really there, of both internally and internationally, with those sort of skills being developed.
Yes. Yes.
Charles, do you see the land value tax and the overall macroeconomic paradigm, if you will, of Henry George's political economics?
Very much.
Do you see this as a
Yes, especially
way
now.
out of the conflict between, say, communism and capitalism? Yeah.
Yes, the ability to distinguish land per se and the improvements one makes on the land is so crucial to an equitable order, I think. Um, to just be caught in the simplistic dualism of what is not privately owned should be state owned. For a long time, that was the way it was. I think that's not, for one thing, it's intellectual laziness, I think, to really not dig deeper into the merits of accepting that land per se is it's a different factor, of production. Uh, I think that many of our schools have stopped teaching that, if they ever did. So we just have to persevere in
It-
getting the literature out and getting the
It's
teachings there.
really key that people understand two different forms of property. That's the property that's nature given, uh, and there's the property that we create with our own labor. And the commons is nature given that we should share, including the value of the commons, the land value, and that what you make with your hands and your mind and everybody else with their hands and their mind is really theirs. They're private property. And then of course we say don't tax what you work for as an individual or a group of people, untax the labor and production, but pull this community created land value back to the community as a whole. That's what should be socialized. And it's an enormous amount. We look at it at maybe a quarter of GDP in value, enough for our public needs. So I think this has been a great session. I don't see any further new
I've got one more.
comments. And David has one more. And then after David, unless I see a new person here with us who has a question or comment, we're going to bring this to a close.
Well, one area I did want to ask about, please, Charles, was the whole area of money and the currency. I don't know what the situation is in Manila or in the Philippines these days with regard to the country. What is the currency? Because the link between the whole financialization of the economy and of land and the new money being created all against, certainly in the UK, against the purchase and trade in land. But what's the situation in the Philippines and has been historically the situation in the Philippines with regard to currency? Is Charles still there? Because I'm not seeing his picture now.
I don't see it either. Maybe there was just an interruption here. So maybe with that, we should have another seminar on money and invite him to that. But
Yeah,
Charles, are you back with us?
don't see him.
Okay, so we will also thank him by email. And I'm wondering if Wendy, now as president of the International Union for Land Value Taxation, if you might unmute yourself and bring us to a close, maybe announce the next session next week and how we intend to do this. Charles is coming in though now. Okay, he got bumped out. He's coming in. So maybe if he heard David's question, and then Wendy can be ready to close us, okay? So Charles, are you there? I saw him in the waiting room again and I let him in, so,
Yeah, I noticed his.
but we still don't see him, do we?
Well, he's listed as participant now, but I'm not seeing.
Oh, I see. Yeah. His system's still trying to get him in, I think. Well, if you don't mind, I think for the purpose of this recording, we're going to bring it to a close. Others who want to stay on afterwards can still chat with each other, okay? So Wendy, could you formally bring this webinar to a close?
I just want to thank Charles for just an incredible presentation. And that I think it demonstrates incredible resilience of humans. And I take my hat off to the Philippines, to the Philippine people for their incredible courage to continue in their lucha for a better future. Next week, same time, we'll have a presentation with Alana Hartzak and Ibrahima Drami. COVID, the corruption of economics and big pharma. It will trace the common link between the distortions of the United States economic and healthcare systems, and consider how this has led to serious physical, mental, and social problems. I think there's many links between the two that will be interesting, and I invite everyone to tune in next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Alana.
Thank you.